Once upon a time, in the beautiful city of Ibadan, there lived a boy named Tayo who never regarded others. He was so rude and disrespectful that people shook their heads whenever he walked by. Tayo would beat up his poor grandmother whenever she tried to correct him, and even left home for days as a way of punishing her, knowing how worried she would be that he didn't return. His mother died whilst giving birth to him, and her mother took on the responsibility of raising him. However, owing to the way his mother died, his grandmother did all she could to avoid situations that would make him miss his dead mother. So, she allowed him get away with so many unruly behavior, and as Tayo began to grow, he became so disrespectful and out of control. She would cry herself to sleep every night, praying that her grandson would one day change his ways. But Tayo was not ready to change. He always got himself into trouble that often required her to spend huge amounts of money to bail him out. One morning, Tayo strolled into the nearby market. He saw an old woman who was selling oranges by the roadside. Without asking, Tayo grabbed some oranges and stuffed them into his bag. The old woman pleaded with him to pay for the fruit. "My son, please pay. These oranges are all that I have," she said to Tayo, who laughed in her face and asked what she was going to do if he refuses to pay. "What will you do if I don't pay? Will you come and take them from me?" he asked the old woman mockingly as he kicked her basket with his foot. Oranges scattered across the dusty road as the old woman fell to her knees and began to pick them up with her trembling hands. People in the market gathered around and began to shout angrily at Tayo. "Shame on you, Tayo! Have you no heart?" But Tayo did not care. He bit into one of the oranges and walked away, laughing without care. Tayo was extremely stubborn. He had no respect for anyone and believed he was untouchable because of the kind of friends that he kept. He once laughed at an old man who was crossing the road with his walking stick. Tayo continued to mock the elderly man, imitating his slow, shaky movements and laughing so loudly that passers-by stared in disbelief. "Look at him," Tayo shouted. "Is he walking or dancing?" he said as he laughed. The old man, hurt but calm, paused and looked at Tayo with his sad eyes. "Young boy, remember this day. Every action has its consequences. You cannot run from them forever," he said to Tayo, who only rolled his eyes and walked away. He had no respect for anyone, and his grandmother bore the brunt of his cruelty daily. One evening, Tayo's grandmother managed to save a small amount of money after weeks of hard labor. She hid it under her mattress, hoping to buy food and medicine, but Tayo discovered the money and stole it. He used it to gamble with his friends, and when she confronted him tearfully, he yelled at her angrily and asked what she was planning to do with the little change. "Is it because of that little money that you are stressing me out?" he asked his grandmother, who broke down in tears and began to cry. She was so devastated, knowing that she had no money left to feed them for the rest of the week. All she worked for weeks, was gone within a flash, and this broke her, knowing that her grandson was leading a very destructive life. That night, Tayo's grandmother knelt by her bedside, tears streaming down from her worn face. She lifted her trembling hands to the heavens and cried out, "Oh God, please touch my son's heart. Let him see the error of his ways before it's too late." But Tayo, oblivious to his grandmother's pain, was out with his friends, gambling and drinking without a single care in the world. The next evening, Tayo and his friends were passing by the mortuary at Ring Road. He dared them to sneak into the mortuary, not caring how sacred it was. "Let's go and see the dead bodies. I hear they keep them stacked like firewood," Tayo said as the others laughed. Tayo, who was always eager to prove how brave he was, convinced them all to sneak into the mortuary. They went in through the back, and an unsettling silence filled the space. Metal tables lined the room, and lifeless bodies lay covered with white sheets. But instead of feeling fear or respect for the dead, Tayo began to laugh hysterically. Look at them, stiff like dried fish. What a waste, he said, pulling back one of the white sheets to mock the lifeless body of a woman that laid beneath. The mortuary attendant, hearing some weird noises, walked in to meet Tayo, laughing and mocking the dead. Young man, the attendant said quietly, his voice filled with anger. You have mocked the dead today. But mark my words, the dead do not forget. Leave this place now before I call the authorities. Tayo and his friends burst into laughter again, completely ignoring the old man's warning. Old man, go back to your ghosts. You can't scare us. Tayo sneered, waving his hand dismissively. But just as they turned to leave, Tayo stopped in his tracks. With a mischievous grin, he turned back to the lifeless body of the woman he had mocked earlier. Look at her, lying there like she owns the place, he said mockingly. Then, in an act of sheer disrespect, Tayo touched the woman's breast, laughing loudly as his friends gasped in shock. The mortuary attendant's face went pale as he murmured under his breath, May the dead have mercy on you, boy. The group ran out of the mortuary, still chuckling, but a strange silence seemed to follow them out into the bustling streets of Ibadan. That night, Tayo could not sleep. His room, usually warm and stuffy, felt ice cold. He tossed and turned on his thin mattress, his eyes darting nervously around the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint whisper. Tayo. He sat up, sweat dripping from his head. Who is there? He said, his voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time even louder. You are mine, the voice said, as Tayo sat there terrified. He turned on the light, but saw no one there. Was I dreaming? He asked himself, as he felt a hot slap across his face. Tayo immediately lost his ability to speak. He did everything possible to speak, but his mouth seemed numb and unable to say a word. He sat there as saliva began to drip down his mouth. Tayo could not understand what was happening. He approached his grandmother's room, his trembling hands clutching the door frame as saliva dripped uncontrollably from his mouth. His grandmother sat up in alarm when she saw him standing there, his wide eyes filled with terror and his lips quivering as if trying to form words. Tayo, what's wrong? Talk to me, she cried, rushing to him. But Tayo could only make incoherent sounds, his mouth refusing to obey him. His grandmother grabbed his face, her eyes scanning him with concern. Did someone hurt you? Tayo, speak to me. Tayo shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. His grandmother's panic grew. She led him to sit on the edge of her bed, praying softly underneath her breath. God of mercy, whatever is wrong with my son, please have mercy. Please, Lord. That night, Tayo sat by his grandmother's side, unable to sleep, unable to speak, and unable to escape the oppressive cold that seemed to cling to his skin. The next morning, word spread around the neighborhood that Tayo had lost his ability to speak. His friends from the mortuary incident came to visit him, their faces pale with fear. One of them whispered, This is not normal. Oh. That mortuary attendant warned us. I knew we shouldn't have gone there. But it was only the beginning of Tayo's torment. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the dead woman, her pale skin and hollow eyes, staring at him, her lips moving silently. Objects in their small home began to move on their own. Pots fell from the shelves, the door creaked open at night, and shadows danced in corners where there should have been none. His grandmother began to hear whispers in her sleep, faint voices calling Tayo's name. As the days passed, Tayo's condition worsened. He lost so much weight because of his inability to eat properly. People began to gossip as they wondered what had happened to him. Some believed he had contracted a deadly disease, whilst others believed that he was cursed. They mocked him, and Tayo, feeling so dejected, began to live a life of isolation. His grandmother did everything to help him, but nothing that she did worked. All the doctors that examined Tayo found nothing wrong with him. As Tayo's condition worsened, his grandmother grew desperate. His frail body was barely able to move, and his once proud and loud demeanor was now reduced to hollow stares and incoherent sobs. One evening, a kind elderly neighbor named Mama Alake paid a visit to Tayo's grandmother. She had heard gossips about Tayo's encounter with the dead woman at the mortuary and came to offer advice. My sister, this is not an ordinary sickness. Take your son back to where this problem started. The dead do not forgive easily when disrespected, Mama Alake said firmly as Tayo's mother shook her head in agreement. They arrived the mortuary the next morning and met the mortuary attendant whose name was Baba Deji, the same man who warned Tayo about his reckless behavior. He stood at the entrance of the mortuary as though he had been waiting for them to arrive. His sharp eyes scanned Tayo's trembling body as he shook his head in disappointment. I warned you, young man, Baba Deji said in a low voice, but you mocked the dead, and now you have awakened something that cannot be easily silenced. His grandmother began to plead with him to help her son. Please, Baba, help my son. Whatever it takes, we will do it. Please, don't let him die like this. Baba Deji sighed deeply and gestured for them to follow him inside. They were led to a small room, lined with old shelves and flickering candles. Baba Deji sat on a wooden stool as he muttered a few words underneath his breath. He then looked directly at Tayo as he began to speak. I have a gift, he began. A gift that allows me to speak to spirits caught between this world and the next. The woman you disrespected, her spirit has spoken to me. His grandmother gasped, clutching her chest as her son stared blankly, his hollow eyes fixed on Baba Deji. The woman you mocked and touched was not just any corpse. Her name was Abeni. She died with deep sorrow in her heart. She had no family, no husband, and no children. She passed away from a broken heart, carrying the weight of loneliness into the grave. Her spirit cannot find rest because she was denied love and companionship in life. And now, Baba Deji's voice dropped lower. She has chosen you, Tayo, to be her husband. His grandmother gasped again, her hand flying to her mouth. What do you mean, Baba? My son, marry a dead woman? Baba Deji nodded solemnly. It is the only way. Abeni's spirit has demanded marriage. Tayo must marry her, give her a proper burial with honor, and visit her grave regularly as her husband. Only then will her spirit rest, and only then will Tayo be freed from this curse. Tayo's grandmother wept bitterly, her frail body shaking as she clutched her son's hands. Tayo himself, though unable to speak, let out a muffled sob as tears rolled down his eyes. Before proceeding with the spiritual marriage, Baba Deji advised them to seek out Abeni's family, if any existed. After days of inquiry in the community and speaking with elders, it was confirmed that Abeni had no living family members. She had been an only child, abandoned by distant relatives, and had died alone in a small rented room. The weight of loneliness and betrayal had taken her to the grave. Realizing there was no family to give their blessings, Baba Deji told them that the marriage must proceed without delay. Under Baba Deji's guidance, preparations began. A small white wedding gown was placed over Abeni's lifeless body, and her hair was adorned with flowers. Tayo, weak and trembling, was dressed in a white abada, representing purity and submission. Baba Deji began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the cold mortuary room. Abeni, daughter of the earth, you are not forgotten. Today you are honored. Today you are loved. He guided Tayo to kneel beside Abeni's body. With a trembling hand, Tayo placed a ring on her lifeless finger. A cold breeze swept through the room, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the air was filled with a faint sorrowful sigh. Baba Deji sprinkled holy water and salt over Abeni's body and whispered final blessings. It is done. Her spirit is now at peace. The next day, a proper burial ceremony was held for Abeni. A small gathering of people attended, led by Baba Deji. Abeni was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery at the outskirts of Ibadan. Tayo, still weak, but able to whisper faint words now, stood beside her grave. I am so sorry, Abeni, for disrespecting you. May you find the peace that you were denied in life. He placed fresh white flowers on her grave and walked away with his grandmother, his head bowed low. Baba Deji warned Tayo that although Abeni was now at rest, their connection was forever. As her husband, Tayo was obligated to visit her grave occasionally, bringing fresh flowers and whispering prayers for her soul. If you neglect her grave, if you forget your promise, the curse will return even stronger. Tayo nodded solemnly, knowing that he could never escape his obligation. In the months that followed, Tayo transformed into a completely different person. He became quiet, humble, and deeply respectful of others. He worked hard to support his grandmother and apologized to her for all that he did to her. Tayo also strolled to the market to find the old woman whose fruit he tossed to the ground some months ago. He found her by the corner and apologized to her for how he treated her on that fateful day. The old woman looked up at him as tears poured down her eyes. She forgave him for all that he did, and Tayo thanked her for her kindness. He handed some money over to her as payment for the oranges, and the old woman was so grateful as she began to bless him fervently. Every month without fail, Tayo also visited Abeni's grave. He placed fresh flowers on the grave and whispered some prayers for her. People in Ibadan began to notice the change in him. They spoke in hushed tones about the boy who had once mocked the dead but was now living a changed life. Tayo has changed, they will say, revealing how the dead had taught him a lesson that he would never forget. And Tayo truly never forgot. For the rest of his life, he carried the weight of his actions and the memory of Abeni, the bride he never truly knew but was forever bound to in spirit. In the quiet cemetery at the edge of Ibadan, a gravestone stood with the words, Abeni, beloved and remembered, rest in peace. And every month, a young man named Tayo would kneel before it, honoring a promise made in fear but kept in love. The lesson to be learned from this story is that every action, no matter how small or insignificant it seems, carries consequences. Tayo's reckless behavior brought about a curse that cost him his peace, his health, and nearly his life. And this serves as a warning that actions done in arrogance and ignorance often lead to regret. Despite Tayo's horrible actions, he was given a chance to make amends and change his life. His transformation into a humble, kind-hearted man proves that people can change when they truly acknowledge their wrongs. I hope you enjoyed the story.